All right. Now, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the first ICOMOS lecture after the summer. My name, as most of you will know, is Sofia Lovegrove, and together with Remco Vermeulen, we will be hosting and moderating this talk as members of the ICOMOS Netherlands Lecture Committee. The committee organizes lectures once a month on different heritage-related topics, and we usually do this in Amsterdam, but due to the pandemic, we have moved these lectures online, and we'll be doing that at least until the end of this year, and we'll see what happens next year. It was mainly due to these circumstances that we decided to take advantage of the fact that many of us are now very used to working and communicating online, to bring together speakers from different countries to engage in a discussion about the topic public monuments, memory, and identity. As I'm sure many of you, all of you will know, statues and monuments related to historical figures and events connected to colonial histories have been brought into the spotlight during the recent Black Lives Matter protests that were reignited by the violent killing of George Floyd on the 25th of May in the United States early this year. And during these protests that spread a little bit around all around the world, statues have been toppled and defaced, and these actions have amplified many different issues, such as the unequal structures in which knowledge about the past, for instance, but other knowledges are, we are now, I think someone is sharing their screen. Okay. Yeah, as I was saying, that these actions have amplified a lot of different issues, and namely how knowledge is often produced in very unequal systems. So the idea of this lecture is to address these and other issues while reflecting on the role of statues and monuments in the public space in 3 different European countries with long colonial histories: Portugal, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. And I'm very, very happy to introduce our speakers this evening. Professor Ann Rigney will start by setting the scene, let's say, and Rebecca Senior will offer a presentation about the British context. Bruno, Sena and Beatriz Gomes will present the Portuguese context, and Nancy Jouwe will talk about the Dutch context. And the presentation will be followed by a short discussion amongst the speakers, after which we will be opening the floor to questions from the audience. And Remco, I think you want to say something about the house rules?
Yes, thank you, Sofia. So some practical announcements. As we already announced in your confirmation email, this session is being recorded, also because we had many requests from people who cannot join, whether they can listen back to it later. So that's just for you to know. And we hope to publish the recording on the ICOMOS Netherlands, the new ICOMOS Netherlands website, but we will, we will post it there whenever that's we can do that. Then, as you already mentioned before, I ask everybody kindly to stay muted. Turn off your microphone during the session so you don't disturb the speakers. If I see that you are unmuted, I will mute you. That's no problem. Then, if you have questions, please put the questions in the chat box, which when you go down on the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon saying chat. You can click on that and then put your chats. Make sure that when you do that, that you send it to everyone and not just to one person. Sometimes that happens. So I will keep track of all the questions that are that you guys are asking, and then during the Q&A moment, which is at the end of the session, I will go through them, go through the questions that I see in the chat. That's just to make sure that not everyone is unmuting themselves at the same time to ask questions. That will be a bit messy.
Thank you. You wanted to mention about the name on the...
Yeah, so because we also want to, we had a lot of registrations for this session, and we would like to keep track of who's actually there. So please, if you can, and your name is not showing completely in your screen, please rename yourself with your first and your last name. And if you don't know how to do that, it's not a big problem. Just if you know how to do it and it is not correct, please adapt.
Thanks, Remco.
Anything else?
I think that's it. I think we can start.
Good. Let's start.
I will be saying something about each speaker as we go along. And as I said, Ann Rigney will start with sort of setting the scene, introducing this topic. And Ann Rigney is Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And she has written extensively on theories of cultural memory. And her research often focuses on the intersections between narrative, collective identity, and contestations of the past. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. If not, please start waving around, Remco, and then I will respond accordingly. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to kick off what looks like being a wonderful session. And I've been asked to say something very general. So I'm happy to do that. And hopefully it will help prepare some of the later talks. Since the beginning of June this year, as Sofia was saying, we've been living something of an iconoclastic moment. Colonial monuments across the United States and Europe have been attacked, destroyed, defaced. All of a sudden, but especially, of course, since the death of George Floyd, monuments have started to matter. But why monuments? The usual answer is that they have a symbolic value. They carry certain stories that purportedly express commonly held values. It's this which makes them, but in my view, it's more than symbols which are at stake. The real importance of monuments lies in their materiality, in their material presence. It's this which makes them different from other symbols and images about the past. We can speak of monuments in terms of vibrant matter, to use Jane Bennett's terms. And as vibrant matter, they make a difference in the lives of city dwellers. They do things in the city. They impress with their size and sometimes with their aesthetic form. Often because of their central location, they force traffic to go around them. They provide meeting points for demonstrators and for supporters to assemble, but also for protesters to assemble. So they have the power to mobilize, and they have the power to offend. So yes, monuments do matter. And our task this evening, I think, is to think more about why they matter and how they do. But before we get lost in the present iconoclastic moment, it's, I think, important to place present discussions in perspective, in a historical perspective, by acknowledging that fighting about monuments is not a recent phenomenon. That, in fact, it's been going on as long as monuments have been made. One can think here of the Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, where the effigies of people who had fallen into disgrace were destroyed. One can think also of the destruction of monuments during the French and Atlantic revolutions at the end of the 18th century. The destruction of the statue of George III in Washington in 1776, for example, was one of the first acts of American independence. And images of these events show a gleeful, cheering crowd celebrating their liberty. One can also mention, of course, and I'd love to mention this example, the spectacular dismantling of the Vendôme column by the Paris Commune of 1871. As a symbol of militarism, it was put up to honor Napoleon. It was experienced by the communards as a daily insult to the spirit of international fraternity, making its towering presence in this city absolutely intolerable. And more recently, of course, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe was marked by an iconoclastic wave which saw statues of Lenin and Marx destroyed, mutilated, removed in collective acts marking the transition from one regime and one set of values to another. So the erection and destruction of monuments is all about who gets to control public space and define the values of society. And by the way, it's always important to ask of a monument not just what it refers back to, but who put it up and when. And most of the statues to the Confederacy, for example, were put up in the 1920s and not in the Civil War era. And so they were designed deliberately to reinvigorate the values of the Confederacy at a later period. So statues are put up at particular moments as interventions in the present. And just as the erection of statues express values and the power to define public space, so too does a removal express regime change and the perceived need to change the collective narrative. Since monuments have an important role in defining public space, their presence is a measure of the power given to particular groups to define what and who is to be remembered collectively. Because while memory is about the past, of course, it's also, and perhaps above all, about who gets to speak in the present. Now, in recent months, fighting about public space and what is to be represented has been presented as something of an anomaly, as a crisis, as something new. But in fact, arguing about the past and in this case, making and breaking monuments, I would say it's par for course in a democracy. Conflict about who and what should be remembered is a good thing if it generates debate about which narratives and actors best represent society. And this has to be a matter of ongoing debate. It's not a debate that we're going to resolve definitively, since groups and perspectives that were hitherto sidelined or actively silent lay claim to the right to be remembered and to have their own history made visible. Every generation has its own blind spots, meaning that memory is never definitive. Now, it seems to me in debating about the past, monuments are particularly useful, and for two reasons. To begin with, their material presence in public provides a focus for people to assemble and for their voices to become heard. But more importantly, perhaps monuments help to crystallize in a material form the discrepancy between ingrained narratives and the need for alternatives. Precisely because they are so fixed in their materiality and location, the gap between what they stand for and the world around them becomes gradually evident until something of a tipping point is reached. Monuments, especially colonial monuments put up in the monumental style of the 19th century, were usually designed for the long haul. They're solidly built, and they represent a huge investment of time and money. However, collective memory is dynamic, as I've been suggesting, so that the meaning of monuments changes even if the objects themselves stay the same.
And sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Could you, because your sound is a little bit bad, could you try to speak a little slower?
A little slow, okay.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay. So I'm saying that because monuments stay the same and the world changes around them, this means that they're particularly important in marking transformations in the collective narrative. We could take the example of the statue to Edward Colston in Bristol. This tribute to the 17th century slave owner was put up by the citizens of Bristol, so not by the state, but on the basis of crowdsourcing, and I think this is important to recall. But it was put up at the end of the 19th century, almost 200 years after his death. And it was meant to express the citizens' appreciation for Colston's purported philanthropic contribution to the prosperity of the city. And the plaque on the monument read, "Erected by citizens of Bristol as a memorial of one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city, AD 1895. By the summer of 2020, however, the same statue, standing in the same place, had acquired quite a different meaning. Instead of expressing pride and gratitude in a virtuous man, it had gradually come to symbolize the perpetuation of a blind disregard for the history of slavery in Britain and the blind disregard for its ongoing legacy in today's racism. The statue had become toxic, an intolerable presence in the city, a public nuisance, to use that wonderful legal understatement, which came to a head when a crowd gathered around the statue and dumped it in the harbour. Now, the history of slavery has been gradually, if albeit very slowly, emerging on multiple fronts in the last decades across all sorts of practices and representations. But the monument allows that emerging memory and the need to make it visible become crystallized at a particular location and in a tangible form. People could literally get their hands on the statue. So it should be clear by now that I agree with the British historian David Olusoga, who's described attacks on monuments not as a destruction of history, but as history itself. Iconoclasm is a symptom of social change, but it's also a conduit for that change, since by changing what we remember publicly, and hence the very configuration of our cities, we also redefine society in terms of who belongs and what are our common values. Now, having said that, of course, there's still a number of issues to be addressed, and I hope we can talk more about them this evening. And there's two lines of discussion I'd like just already to flag. And the first one is the most obvious one. What do we do with monuments once they become toxic? How do we decommission monuments so they lose their power and change their meaning? Now, we've been seeing various options in the last months, and I believe lots could be learned and still could be learned from the best practices developed after the fall of communism. And we've seen all sorts of creative vandalism and guerrilla art and different ways of trying to approach statues. Of course, the most extreme form is total destruction, which of course has the disadvantage of erasing and perhaps also whitewashing history by pretending it never happened. An alternative is to add a new plaque, though a plaque, of course, will have to be very large if it is to compensate for the impact of a large monument. Another option is to overwrite the original monument with graffiti that highlight the history that the monument silenced. Or you could even think of putting up a competing monument beside the old one. And I'm thinking here of the guerrilla monument of Jean Reid, which was put up on the pedestal, the empty pedestal to Colston. So these are all different options, and I think there's many more emerging all the time, and I think this is something that we have to think more about for giving a monument a new meaning while leaving it in location. Another option, of course, is to relocate the monument and put it in storage, but then, of course, it becomes invisible, or putting it in some form of a museum, such as happened in Budapest, where we have this very interesting statue park which collects many of the monuments to the communist era and puts them in an open air park. And once a monument has been relocated to a park, it also actually it remains the same object, but it changes status. It loses its power to generate awe and respect, and becomes instead a display object, which we can look at as a relic of the past rather than as a power in the present. So I think there's a lot of discussion we can have about the best way of re-signifying a monument. So the second question is perhaps a more fundamental question, is about how far to go with iconoclasm, and perhaps even more importantly, how fast should we go? The intensity of the current discussion about statues and about street names reflects its importance, and as I've been trying to suggest, the fact that these things really do matter. But I think for this iconoclastic moment to be really productive and really transformative and not just productive of new forms of amnesia, we shouldn't try to change everything all at once. We should perhaps go slow as well and think of what it means to go slow. There needs to be a concerted discussion about what needs to be retained or not, how we can signify toxic heritage, as I've been suggesting, how public monuments and markers relate to more intangible forms of memory, and what sort of monumental culture, if any, should replace the present one. I think a well-informed discussion of these issues and using these discussions to revive collective narratives may actually be as important as the end result as far as the statues themselves are concerned. Finally, we need to ensure that the attention paid to statues, important as it is, doesn't end up as being a big distraction from other pressing issues in the present. We have to be careful of making memory a lightning conductor for dissent rather than a conduit for social change, because it would make inequality a matter merely of the past rather than of the present. So if you have changed your statue, then you've solved all your problems. I think this is a huge and interesting question and challenge for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was, I think, a perfect way to start this evening, and I'm sure that a lot of your points will come up later in the discussion and the questions. I'm now going to introduce Rebecca Senior from the United Kingdom. I don't see you on my screen yet, but I'm sure you will appear in a second. Rebecca is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Her research focuses on art histories of monuments and how historical commemorative art was designed to express collective British identity in the 18th and 19th centuries. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Great. Hi everyone. I'm from the north of England, so I speak very loudly but also very quickly. So I will try and speak much slower than I usually do. And yeah, thank you to Sofia and Remco for organising and inviting me to speak. Remco, I think, are you okay to share the PowerPoint that I sent along? Okay, great. Yes, it's a real privilege to take part in an event that connects this many people critiquing monuments across Europe. So I'm going to talk really briefly about monuments and their connections to imperial histories in the UK, and a little bit about my research. So my background is art history, so there are lots of pictures. And unless otherwise stated, all the images are sourced from the internet or they are my own. And just as a trigger warning for this presentation, there are no images of this, but I briefly talk about racism, racially motivated police violence, and enslaved people. Okay, so over the past several months in Britain, monuments have gained new significance as visual markers of both historic and contemporary injustice and racially motivated violence. Media coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd by police in May 2020 drew new attention to pre-existing campaigns to remove monuments in the UK. So these interventions were not really about monuments themselves, but the anti-blackness and systemic racism they represent and have represented the communities who didn't consent to sharing their physical space with these historical objects. So it's quite fitting that Anne has mentioned Edward Colston, because this is an image of him being fished out of Bristol Harbour by Bristol City Council. So when Black Lives Matter protesters pushed the statue of notorious enslaver Edward Colston into the harbour in June this year, it appeared as a climactic finale to the campaign for its removal, which had already been several years in the making from historians, community organisers and campaigners. Oh, Remco, if you could change the slide, please. Thank you. The Roads Must Fall campaign, which gained traction when student protesters forced the removal of a monument to British imperialist Cecil Rhodes from the University of Cape Town in 2015, continues at the University of Oxford as organisers fight to remove the statue from the Rhodes building, which is on the right. But more importantly, they fight for a less white curriculum and new measures to combat racial discrimination at the university. These initiatives have paved the way for removals in other civic spaces in the UK. So one example is Thomas Picton, who was the British governor of Trinidad in the 19th century and found guilty of, but never sentenced for, the torture of an enslaved African child. He had a statue in the Welsh Heroes Gallery of Cardiff City Hall until its removal earlier this year. Though many argue that these monuments don't or no longer represent the beliefs and values of the UK, critical engagement with them has emphasised that many of the racist ideologies of those commemorated continue to perpetuate in the present. As deliberate physical insertions of white supremacy into public space, these monuments visualise a hierarchy of beliefs based on race and class. If you could change the slide. A pertinent visual representation of this are the many photographs of members of Britain First, the English Defence League and other far-right nationalist organisations who've taken it upon themselves to protect these statues as precious relics of empire. I haven't included any images of them as they're all over the internet, but this is the now infamous image of the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square in London, which was boarded up ahead of Black Lives Matter protests earlier this year. If you change the slide, thanks Remco. Interestingly, the Churchill monument has already been appropriated several times by protesters over the last 2 decades. So the image on the far left is from an anti-capitalist protest in 2000. The centre image is from 2007. And the right image was taken during the protests against the rise of tuition fees in 2010. If you could change the slide, thank you. So though the often violent tactics of groups such as the EDL are easy to spot, I've found that it's the quieter, conservative British exceptionalism that often drives other arguments against removal. So as Anna's already mentioned, some suggest that removing monuments is erasing history, or that the philanthropic monetary donations of these monument subjects, so this is obviously especially in the case of Rhodes and Colston, somehow negates their racist violence and makes them worthy of a place in public space. I find that the same argument, a misty-eyed longing for empire and the good old days, have appeared with increasing regularity over the past 5 years in the UK and contributed to the narratives around Brexit, the national press's stigmatisation of migrants, and the discriminatory conditions cultivated by the Conservative government. I'm interested in monuments because they're a reflection of history, which is never neutral or based on fact, but an expression of certain belief systems. So monuments are artistic constructs that canonise by exclusion. So I just thought I would briefly talk about a monument that is just around the corner from where I live, kind of as a case study that brings together some of these threads, and also my interest in iconography and visual systems of power. So if you could change the slide, please. Thanks. So this is the monument to Queen Victoria, which sits at the corner of Hyde Park in Leeds, West Yorkshire, in the north of England. It was sculpted by George Frampton and originally erected outside Leeds Town Hall in 1905, but was subsequently moved to the park in 1937. Queen Victoria is the most commonly monumentalised monarch in Britain. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, over 70 monuments and statues were erected in her memory, with others in sites of historical British extraction and settler colonialism, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Malaysia, among others. In Britain, she's been adopted as a colonial icon, with her image appearing across a multitude of objects within visual and material culture, so from tea towels, Toby jugs and commemorative plates to pub signs and road markers. On the Leeds monument, a representation of Victoria sits enthroned at the summit of a pedestal. The statue is actually a duplicate of two other identical monuments in Merseyside, Liverpool and Winnipeg, Canada. Below her statue is a rectangular plinth. If you could change the slide. Two niches are carved for allegorical figures. So the one on the right is called Peace, and the missing one from the left is called Industry, which is now in a local museum. On the base of the monument are a series of country and continent names. So India, Australia, Africa, and Canada. Visually, the monument is an overt celebration of British colonialism. The figures of peace and industry echo the insidious narrative which propagated that the British Empire was a benevolent and paternalistic organisation. The entire composition is a vertical and therefore hierarchical representation of empire, with Victoria and Britain at the top and the colonised countries and continents at the bottom. The monument itself is a colonial fantasy, where Queen Victoria's calm yet imposing figure becomes a personification of the supposed ease with which Britain wielded power over its colonised countries and indigenous peoples. Slide, please, thank you. Perhaps as a result of this composition and the critical eye that had been cast over other monuments in the UK, on the 9th of June this year, the monument was covered in graffiti that recreated messages from the Black Lives Matter movement. This physical alteration enabled the monument to take on new visual and iconographic significance. The monument's new appearance put it into dialogue with a global movement that is spread in part through visual symbols and shared languages of representation. An article written by University of Pittsburgh PhD student Charles Athanasopoulos for the organisation Monument Lab, and I can put a link to it in the chat, explores this in more detail and examines the Black Lives Matter movement as a multimodal monument in and of itself. Slide please, Remco. So overlaying historical monuments with new imagery transforms them into spaces of reclamation and outlets for grief, frustration and anger. An example of this, I'm sure we're all familiar with, is the monument to Confederate General Robert E. Lee on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. And this photograph is courtesy of Kevin Cranford, who's the founder of an organisation called United Statues of America, which you can find on Instagram, who also told me that the whole of Monument Avenue has now been reclaimed as a new type of exhibition space. As an art historian, monument destruction, alteration and removal draws attention to systemic injustice by altering the UK's visual landscape in profound ways. It sparks important debate about how identity formation and memory have been shaped in the UK, what alternative means of commemoration are appropriate going forwards, and how the focus on monuments can hopefully be shifted towards meaningful change. Thanks. I think I'm under 10 minutes.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a very interesting and visually evocative presentation. I'll move on to a different context, to Portugal. And I will introduce both speakers together. So Bruno Sena Martins is senior researcher at the Center of Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. His research interests include disability, human rights, racism and colonialism, amongst others. And Beatriz Gomes is a teacher and activist, and since 2019, she's a member of the Portuguese Parliament for the Left Bloc. She is the founder and leader of JAS, the Association of Afro-Descendants, which aims to fight racism and promote the rights of Black and Afro-descendant individuals in Portugal.
Good evening to everyone. Are you listening to me?
Sorry?
Are you listening to me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm here.
I will start thanking you for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to take part in this meeting and this conference so that we can exchange ideas about the times that we are living today. I would give some context, then I will pass the word to my colleague and good friend Beatriz. I would say that the silencing of colonial violence is one of the cornerstones of the post-imperial democratic reconstruction of Portuguese society after 1974. In this sense, I would say that Portugal shares with other former colonial empires an Eurocentric representation of national and European history, one that disregards that much of the European experience took place outside European borders. The oblivion of Portuguese colonial violence and racist past overlooks, for example, the central role of Portugal in the transatlantic slave trade. So that you know, Portuguese were responsible for the transport of over 5.8 million enslaved people, 47% of the total. And also, the Portuguese empire ended with a colonial war, a conflict between 1961 and 1974 that opposed the Portuguese armed forces to the independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. By 1974, Portugal had, after Israel, the highest proportion in the world of people in arms. The human effort was 5 times superior in comparison to the one employed by the United States in Vietnam. So, in this sense, Portugal has many living witnesses of colonialism and colonial violence, not only ex-combatants, but also former colonial settlers that came back after the colonization process. So we could say that for many centuries and until recently, colonial and racist violence in Portugal has been a public secret, to use Michael Tausig's concept, that which is generally known but cannot be articulated. So I point out some of the conditions of impossibility, the conditions that do not allow this articulation of the history of colonial violence in Portugal. Several factors should be attended. The first is the fact that Portuguese discoveries, the maritime exploration during the 15th and 17th, 16th centuries, they support an epic collective identity in Portugal. And that is important for the self-esteem, for the self-love of Portuguese nationalism. Also, the persistence of Luso-tropicalist imagination, which is a benign and non-racist perspective of Portuguese colonialism. And this is a legacy from the final phase of Estado Novo, the fascist regime in Portugal. The third factor is the fact that the oppositions to this fascist colonial regime of Estado Novo was always more anti-fascist than anti-colonial, and rarely has been anti-racist. So there is also a tradition in the oppositions in the left to disregard anti-colonialism and anti-racism. The third element is the intimate relation of the democratic regime born of the Carnation Revolution in 1974 with colonial war and colonialism. This coup d'etat, this revolution, was born of the discontent of the middle-level officers that were in the colonial war. So the heroes of democracy were also ex-combatants of the colonial war, and this created a space of discomfort, a kind of taboo in terms of the massacres, the violences that those military people witnessed and were part during the war. The fifth element is the fact that the former colonial settlers, for the former colonial settlers and their families, to admit the racist character of Portuguese occupation in Africa has meant a very difficult gesture, is the one of accepting that their lives, of their parents, were complicit with the colonial racist system. It's very common in Portugal for you to hear someone say, okay, my father was in Africa, he was a colonist, but he is a good person. So there is this familiarity, it is something reticular in Portuguese society, those experiences of colonialism. But this reality, this public secrets is showing, is breaking. This reality is changing with the resistance to a celebratory depiction of the colonial past that has gained recent visibility through a set of debates that bring together, I would say, a coalition, an inorganic coalition between Afro-descendants, Black people, and some sectors of academia, historians, people from social sciences, and this coalition created some space for the upsurge of an anti-colonial movement that brings new memories and claims for new memorials. So the rising prominence of an anti-colonial and anti-racist activism has unsettled the placid colonial nostalgia that has long prevailed in Portugal. There is an important emerging generation of Black people that are today gaining visibility as members of parliament, the case of Beatriz, as activists, as artists, as academics. And so we now witness a collective affirmation of their identities as Black people, as Black person, our identities, alongside a public denunciation of institutionalized racism and the colonial imaginary reflected in museums, statues, curricula, street names. I want to signal for events that are both symptomatic and constitutive of this transformation. Recent events in the last years. The first happened in April of 2019, 3 years ago, in 2017. Marcelo Rebelo Sousa was in Gore Island, an infamous departure point for the transatlantic slave trade, and he said, Portugal, praised Portugal for having recognized the injustice of slavery when it introduced abolitionist laws in the 18th century. In response to this claim, there was an open letter by several academics and intellectuals repudiating the president's statements, criticizing this benign view of a Portuguese pioneer humanism. And they said, not in our name. In July of the same year, the Public Prosecutor's Office accused 18 police officers of the Alfragide police station of various crimes such fabrication of documentation, slanderous denunciation, falsehood of testimony, torture, among others, that were aggravated by racism. That these officers practiced against 6 young people after their detention in the neighborhood of Cova da Moura. This case opened a debate in the public and in the media. And the question was, is Portuguese a racist country? There were several articles, there were TV debates on this issue. Also, in 2017, the electoral program of the incumbent mayor, Fernando Medina, proposed the building of the Museum of Discoveries. And there was important opposition by 100 Black activists and intellectuals that urged the government not to confuse slavery, invasion, rape with discovery and maritime expansion. So this was an important moment. The other moment, and I'll give the word to Beatriz to talk more about this, was the fact that in 2017, a memorial to the victims of slavery proposed by JAS was an association of Afro-descendants, was selected in Lisbon's participatory budget. Before I give the word to Beatriz, I just want to say that in these times that we are living now of Black Lives Matters, of iconoclasm, I think that it would be a supreme fantasy to think naively that we can fully recognize the racist violence that lies beneath the foundations of our nation empires, our post-empires, if we leave in place the very stones that sustain the idea of a racist nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Beatriz.
Thank you very much, Sofia, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to share with you our project, the project of building a memorial for the victims of slavery. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you our project. So this is one of the view of the project that is going to be built in Lisbon, that is called Plantation, Prosperity and Nightmare. This project was one of the most voted projects, and it was made by Quiloange Quiaenda, an Angolan, an artist that lives between Luanda and London and Lisboa. This is another view of the same project, and Quiloange Quiaenda says that Plantation, Prosperity and Nightmare is intended to address the memory of slavery as a present of an absent. As we do not believe it is possible to directly and realistically represent such transnational trauma, we then turn to the raw material, sugarcane, the white gold, that was at the origin of the compulsory slave trade. So this is one of the things that Quiaenda wrote on the description of the project. So we see the place where the memorial will be. This is the plant of the same place, and you can see here is the project of the memorial in honor of the enslaved person. This is a picture of the artist Quiloange Quiaenda, and this is some of the images of two spaces that the memorial will be constructed. This is the place where the art piece of Quiaenda is going to be built, and this is a square in the center of the city, and it is a place that is related with slave trade. This is one of the things that we thought that was very important for the memorial. It was to be in the center of the city in a very easy place to go, because it has a lot of public transportation. And in the right, we have another building that is going to have an interpretation center that is going to it's going to be some exhibition, and it's going to be between the story that is the memorial is going to talk in the public space will be completed with this exhibition. There is going to be a permanent exhibition and some temporary exhibitions and some lectures, and all a wide range of events are going to happen in this center of interpretation. The memorial for the enslaved person was the project that JAS presented to participated budget in 2017, and we had the help. It was a very participatory project. We had the help of a consultant group that help us to identify the artists that we are going to address the invitation to build the monument. So this group was made by some scholars, some academic researchers, Black activists, and anti-racist activists. And we identify 5 artists that we were invited. These artists, from these 5 artists, three accepted the invitation, and the artist that accepted was Quiloanski Ayenda, Grada Quilomba, and Jaime Laureano. The process of choosing the proposal was made about various public session that the public voted for the project that it was most that they were most pleasant for them. So the project that won was the most voted from these 6 sessions that we made around Lisbon, in the regions of strong presence of African descent and African people in the Lisbon area. So the votation was between December 2019 and February 2020, and it is very important because we had a wide range of people that went especially to the place where the session were going to happen, to be able to vote and to choose the project that was going to be the memorial for the in honor of the enslaved person. What is the aim of our project? The principal aim of our project is to pay tribute to millions of African people who were enslaved by Portugal throughout history. As Bruno says, this was very important between the 15th and 19th centuries, and there is no other monument in Portugal that speaks throughout this period of history. So it was very important to put this period in the public space and to build a narrative that goes against the narrative of discoveries that is already placed, that is very common in Portugal. Also, we wanted to contribute to recognition of the role of Portugal in the transatlantic slave trade, but also to celebrate the resistance of African against oppression and slavery, and also to celebrate the centuries-old Black and African people that live in Portugal, the presence of these people in Portugal, and also the contribution of them for the Portuguese economy, culture, and society. So I go show you some images of the public buildings. They are very common in Portugal. This is the This is the most celebrated one, that is called Padrão dos Descobrimentos, that celebrates discoveries. But also we have this museum on Lagos, that is a wax museum that also celebrates discoveries. And we have the streets names. This is the name of a navigator of this 15th century, and you can see these African heads on this heraldica that symbolized that people that were engaged in slave trade, and they get rich with this economic activity. And so this is Mosteiro dos Jerónimos. This is a very important monument in Portugal, and you see an enslaved person head that is in the facade of the building. So we have a lot of representation of Black people in public monuments, but we don't celebrate this as part of the Portuguese society. This is one of the representation of Black people outside a monument that is in Coimbra, that is called Portugal dos Pequenitos, that shows Black people outside of the society, not belonging to the society. Some of the other questions and other things that I had to say about this monument, I'll leave it to the discussion, so I won't take much more time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Beatriz, and Bruno as well, for your presentations. And I will give the word to Nancy. Before, I will just mention, if anyone has questions, please do put them in the chat. I see a couple of questions already, but feel free to add your questions as we go. So Nancy Jouwe is a researcher, speaker, and lectures in the MA in Fine Arts at the HQU Faculty of Arts in Utrecht, in the Netherlands. Her research and work focuses on intersectionality, colonial history, art heritage, and intercultural dialogue. And she was at the basis of the Mapping Slavery Research Project here in the Netherlands. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? All right. I see a lot of familiar names, so hi to you, but also a warm welcome to everyone. And I'm very excited to be part of this amazing panel, and thank you for the former speakers. I've learned already so much from you, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation after. I've been a little bit ambitious. So I'm going to give a mini lecture because I want to make sure that you understand my interpretation also of Dutch colonial history before I sort of dive into post-colonial afterlives and the materiality of that. So to begin with, I want to share with you that for many Dutch people, colonialism is understood as something that started in the 19th century, but actually when the Dutch Republic, after fighting the Spaniards for so long, became a republic, right from the beginning, as an independent political entity, the Dutch were involved in a colonial enterprise. And in social sciences, in world system theory, for instance, modern capitalism is sort of placed in the 16th century, the end of 16th century, and this is where we can see the Netherlands also being at the vanguard of this phase of capitalist development, globalization, and colonialism. So if we look at the Dutch colonial empire, it involves 3.5 centuries and at least 4 different continents. The Dutch were really global players in the 17th centuries with the Americas, New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, of course, but also New Holland, the Guyanas, the Caribbean islands, different parts of Africa, but also different parts of Asia. And our kind of colonialism was, you could call, rather than people really settling, as in settler colonialism, Dutch colonialism could be called mercantile imperialism. It was sort of divided between two groups, the West India Company and the East India Company, which were chartered companies. But they were also instruments in warfare and politics. They had a lot of power. They could negotiate with foreign powers on their own. They were drivers of economic activity, drivers of research and science, and obviously also the first to use stock. So shareholders pitching in with money. And so the financial markets that came out of that were also sort of born out of that type of colonialism that the Dutch were masters at, you could say. And if we look at Asia, you could see that they had to deal with different territories in different ways. So you could call this a form of ruthless pragmatism, where the VOC, for instance, in Japan, was very much controlled by the Japanese and had to stay put in a particular part where they could be sort of controlled. Whereas if we look at Banda, which is in the southeast part of current Asia, in the Indonesian archipelago and on Banda Nera, there they became really ruthless and sent in the military and basically slaughtered a large part of the indigenous population, after which they started slavery plantations that used slave labor for making use of the nutmeg plantations that were there. In Suriname, on the other side of the Dutch Empire, in the highlight, in the heyday, so to speak, of that part of empire, there were 600 plantations, predominantly sugar plantations, which were sort of governed from the city of Amsterdam. So the Society of Suriname was the largest shareholder, together with the city itself, and a family. So the three shareholders were part of the, basically owned the plantation Society Suriname. So different parts and different ways of dealing with that. Now, how did that reflect in the metropole itself? You could see that in the 17th century, and this is why we still predominantly in the Netherlands call it the Golden Age, you could see houses being built along the canals. This is the Golden Bend that's then being built, which then of course was also being painted. Painters were commissioned because people suddenly had money to show off basically their new riches. And here you see, for instance, a painting of a East India Company merchant with his wife and an enslaved merchant. And so after emancipation, so after slavery was abolished in 1863, people were still forced to work on the plantations for 10 years, after which the Dutch had dealt with, made a deal with the English and basically got cheap labor from different parts of Asia, China, British India, but also the Netherlands Indies, which basically makes for the multicultural society that Suriname currently is. Again, mirroring the metropole, obviously this is also a time where the Dutch were very proud of their colonies, so they showed that off also in world exhibitions. This one in Amsterdam attracted 500,000 people over 6 months, where they also had organized villages where people from Suriname and the Dutch East Indies were basically gathered to put on display, like a human zoo, if you will. But also our Queen Wilhelmina was offered a golden coach in that same era. This is around 1900, when she became a queen. She got a golden coach from the people of Amsterdam, and one of the side panels depicted that same storyline of the Netherlands getting their riches from the East and the West, and Black people basically bringing those riches to the Netherlands. And we just heard the news yesterday that this golden coach that is used by the king annually to sort of open the political year is now taking off the road to be put in a museum temporarily, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so we've entered the 20th century, and if we look at traces of colonialism and traces of slavery, we can then actually still see them in public space if we really look well. But this is also the age, the 20th century, and this is a book that was co-written by 4 researchers that basically, sorry, state that there was a whole century's silence that went around this history of slavery and colonialism, but this particular book was about slavery. Yet, if we look in public space, and Beatriz also showed a picture of that, this is actually the same court where Anne works. So Anne, I hope you can appreciate this, but this is, for instance, a depiction of 3 blackamoors, you could say, in a shield in actually a building from the university. So you could say that the Netherlands wasn't really keen on doing a lot of statues. So this era of the late 19th century, when a lot of statues were erected, you could see that the Netherlands didn't have a lot. But what they did do was, for instance, build different neighborhoods around the country. So there were 90 cities that had in these neighborhoods, so Indo-European neighborhoods, the street names basically reflecting colonial pride. But there were, of course, monuments. This is the Van Heuts monument, who was sort of a military powerhouse in colonial times, who slaughtered a lot of people. And these are some of the moments, 1965, 1967, 1984, a couple of times, and later on in 1991. So you see 3 decades already of people basically trying to protest, also violently at some points, this particular monument. So in this, well, in the former decade, 2003, it was actually renamed to sort of detach it from that particular person. Koen, J.P. Koen is another one who's been very important to tackle. One of the very few who did have a statue in his place of birth that was also defamed, but he's also sort of built in the buildings in Amsterdam. So he's been someone who's been talked about quite directly during the June Black Lives Matter sort of month. But luckily, people of color throughout the 2 decades have themselves erected monuments to, so have done public interventions in public space. This is the national slavery on the top left, the national slavery monument in Amsterdam. That was followed by a statue in a monument, I should say, in the south, in Zeeland, and then also in Amsterdam. I know Wim Raniers is here from Rotterdam. So Rotterdam also had a monument. So at least 3 or actually 4 or 5 monuments already refer to the history of slavery. All sort of also instigated by local people of color, grassroots folks. We've been talking about defamation and destroying of monuments. Actually, in the Netherlands, this monument was defamed. You cannot really see it clearly, but it says WLM, which stands for White Lives Matter. So this is Eliezer, who was a black servant who came with Portuguese merchants to Amsterdam, Portuguese merchants who had to flee, and who brought also their slavery trade networks with them, including their black servants. And so for this particular black servant, a monument was erected, which was then defamed during, again, that infamous June month of a couple of months ago. Luckily, it's been restored again. But also museums are monuments where we can see this colonial past reflected, like a palimpsest or like a lieu de mémoire. So in the building of the Tropen Museum, which it's now called, but which used to be the Colonial Museum, we can still see those colonial remnants. And the museum is really trying to rethink its position in a decolonial 21st century. What does that entail? And we even have their director saying that, well, our museum was part of a racist system. And this is a remark made, well, we couldn't see that happening 5 years ago. So a lot of stuff has been moving since the last sort of decade already, and already referred to that. So lastly, I want to basically share with you this, this quote from Professor of Political History Suzanne Lejeune, who in her book Spiegelreflex, which talks about the materiality of the colonial past, basically says, and I fully agree with her, Dutch culture developed in many ways as a colonial culture, and its traces inform our current society. We can see it in artistic expressions and cultural patterns, but also more generally in prevailing societal views. There is, for instance, a connection between the colonial past and current normative ideas about the Dutch nation and active cultural citizenship. And so the erection of those slavery monuments, I think, is a true example of that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Sophia, where are you?
I had a technical problem. Okay. Thank you, Nancy, for your talk. It was really interesting and very all-encompassing, I would say, as well.
Sorry about that.
No, I mean it in a good way. But before we open the floor to questions, because I see already a few questions popping up, I was going to ask if the speakers, if you might have any questions to each other or reactions, comments on your each other's presentations.
Shall I just unmute myself? Is that the easiest way to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Beatriz. Thank you for your presentation. It was, yeah, so interesting to hear about the process of a new monument being built. But actually, I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about the monument at the end of your presentation that you didn't quite get to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the questions in the chat. Yeah, from Kees Lafeber. Maybe I'll also add it because I think it's a similar question. He asks, are there any thoughts also to start contextualizing the ill-famous Grand Monument to the Discoveries, so the Padrão dos Descobrimentos? I think it's also a good question.
Can I speak, or can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I thank the question that Rebecca made me. I can put the image again, so I can talk about a little bit about that image. So this one. They're representing African people, and they are outside a park that is called Portugal dos Pequenitos. Inside that park, we have small representation of Portuguese villages and Portuguese houses. And this person that they are part of the Portuguese colonies because they were brought or they lived in the occupied countries in the country that Portugal occupied. This person, they are not inside, they are outside the park, and they are guarding the park. So you can see they are not full person. They have they are torsos. So this representation of Black people, it's very common, it's very stereotyped, and that keeps Black people outside of the participation of Portuguese society. So I think the metaphor for these images, that is that Black people doesn't belong to Portuguese society. So we are strangers in Portuguese society. So we are second-class citizens, but I think most of that we don't belong to the Portuguese society, because there is an image that Portuguese society, it's all white, so Black people doesn't belong. These images are reinforcing this idea of country that has colonies, but the people Black people, they are from that colonies, they don't belong to Portugal. So from one side we have all this glorification of discoveries that you can see in Padrão aos Descobrimentos, and that the Portuguese went and discovered all these countries, and had this amazing achievement of technology, and we don't have a counterpart of this narrative. So we don't talk about the violence, the exploitation, and all the things that happened in the country that were occupied by Portugal. But we don't talk about racism, about the contemporary racism that was inaugurated with the slavery, and it was reinforced by colonialism and all the laws that were put in place by the colonial period. So we with this monument, with the monument to celebrate the enslaved person, we want to bring all these questions to the public space and to the debate, so that debate would be more complete. So one of the aspects of one of the objectives of our monument is to contribute to a more rigorous and comprehensive knowledge of the history of Portugal, serving as an instrument of pedagogy or for the present and for future generations. So people can learn about slavery and think in a more critical way about racism and also about the Portuguese history. In my presentation, I forgot to show you. Sorry, I can't do it, so I must stop. I want to show you the link where you can see have more information about the monument, but I'll put the link in the chat.
That would be great. Thank you, Beatriz. And I think I got confused about the two photographs that show different things. And the question from Case of Lefebvre was indeed about the Discoveries Monument, which I think you also showed in your presentation.
Yes.
Asking if indeed there are any, is there any kind of movement to try to contextualize the monument or to challenge the narrative that the monument is articulating?
Okay, I can't go back in my presentation, but I think that our monument is a counter narrative. So we are occupying the public space with another history that is not being told in Portugal. So one of the things that we want to have in our center of interpretation, it's events that talk about the monuments that they are addressing to discoveries, and to think critically about these monuments. So we are in a movement that is already thinking about the Padrão dos Descobrimentos and other monuments that are in the public space, and we want to oppose to that monument and oppose to the narrative that they are telling, the story they are telling.
Thank you. I was wondering if there are any more questions from the speakers to the speakers. If not, I just wanted to ask a question before giving also space to the audience to ask questions. Because I think Ann Rigney didn't have, well, in the 10 minutes that we limited you to, you didn't have much time to talk about, or no time at all to talk about your current research project, which I think is very interesting in the context of what has been happening this year. It's called Remembering Activism, the Cultural Memory of Protests in Europe. And I was wondering if you could maybe say something about it.
Thank you, Sofia. Of course, I would be delighted to say lots about it, but I'll try and temper my enthusiasm here. Yes, it's a project which is trying to see how this question of memory works together with attempts to change the world. I mean, a lot of our thinking about memory says it's about the past. And it's about things which happened long ago, and that is, of course, one of the arguments that's often used in defense of toxic monuments, as I call them, the sense that, okay, it's only about the past. But of course, it's not about the past, it's about the ways in which the past plays into the present, and how the monuments then, taken as a reflection of collective values, are seen to perpetuate that past. And our project is trying to look at the different ways in which remembering the past shapes the ways in which we imagine futures together. So, and I think this is at the core of this whole issue today, which is about the notion of more inclusivity, overcoming of silences and of gaps, and making certain paths more visible. But of course, behind this is not just the notion that it's just interesting to have more monuments in our cities. We could say there's enough monuments out there. Why make new monuments? But of course, the making of the new monument is a way of giving a place and giving a voice to groups who are very much present and who have a stake in the future of the country. And it is one of the ways in which that stake is claimed is by operating towards making new voices emerge. And I thought this was a fascinating case that Beatriz gave us of the, I think if I got it correctly, this Plantation Prosperity Nightmare, a very wonderful title and a wonderful piece of very striking presence in the cityscape. So it's really operating in a cityscape in a new way. So we have these movements towards making hidden histories, repressed histories, make them visible in some way, and to start the conversation, to start allow people to listen. But we also have, again, so we have the question of decommissioning the old ones, and I think this interplay between this sort of fighting to make new hidden voices heard in their own terms, and these are different. There's a different aesthetics associated with these new types of monuments, and we often call them memorials rather than monuments. So. But there's a new aesthetics there, but they have to somehow intersect with the old, and that I think is one of the big challenges, and not only in just making new voices be heard, but how do you create a conversation between the different presences in the city space. And I see in one of the chats somebody has asked about this, how does one create circumstances of conversations between different narratives? And I think this is one of a very interesting thing to think about, and the question is this something which takes place through the language and through the instrument of monuments, or is it rather through the questions of different types of performance and different types of meetings and assemblies? And I think this is something that we should be also thinking about, is how this monumentalization and the city space relates to other types of activism, but also different types of assembly and meetings, and the creating of meeting places where conversations take place. And I'm sure Beatriz and others and Nancy have been involved in thinking in different ways in which you can create spaces for encounters and spaces for dialogue, rather than just simply increasing the number of different voices, because we also have to try and think about how you bring these voices together in some sense of a common future. And I think these are all what we've been discussing this evening are all part of that. But it's obviously not as it's easier said than done, especially when it comes to how one deals with what one might call banal, the banal presence of colonialism, not these big monuments, but in the sort of details that were there in Nancy's presentation, but also in Beatriz's of sort of hidden minor presences that we've got so used to that we've become inured to. So maybe there's also ways in which around those minor presences and banal presences, we can think of different ways of making them visible again and making also their significance visible in ways that is not just a way of getting rid of them, but talking about how we live with these entangled histories, because that's what they are.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I think that the issue of how to engage in a conversation, an equal conversation with different sides, how to enable that, I think that's a very important question. It's a very difficult one, I think, sometimes. Remco,
yeah, I think Nancy wanted to respond to what Anne was saying.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also important then to raise the question, you know, new to whom? New voices is of course a relative term, because in the Netherlands, if we look at, you know, people going into the streets to commemorate the history of slavery, we see a march in 1963 through Amsterdam of a large group of mostly Surinamese, people of Surinamese descent. And within several communities, the histories of colonialism and slavery have been commemorated already for decades. This is why I also, you know, wanted to point to this notion of silence, that the voices have been silenced rather than not being there. They were there. So this is why it's important to raise the question, new to whom?
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to raise also is, so yeah, I'd love to hear more and see more about indeed the initiative in Portugal. I had heard some of it already, and it's really amazing. Some of the memorials and monuments that have been erected, also for Anton de Kom, for instance, in the Bijlmer Southeast, have been done with public engagement. So that has been a public process with people involved from the communities. But it's always a very difficult process. So I think because I saw a question from in the chat on this, so how can professionals deal with that? I think we should then learn from good and bad practices. So familiarize yourself with things that have been initiated by grassroots communities around the Netherlands. And I think a lot of you don't know that much about that, I think. I might be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not sure. And also we can see now in different cities, City of Utrecht now says they also want to do slavery monument, to erect one. So there's a lot of mobility at the moment, which I think is really important to familiarize ourselves with.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Sofia, is it okay if I go to one of the questions in the chat? Because, well, the speakers are very efficient, actually, because both Anne and Nancy already addressed two questions that were posed in the chat, so we can skip those. Or at least I hope that they have been answered properly. This is a question from Tamara van Kessel. Thank you to speakers and organizers for this rich set of presentations. The example of the new plantation prosperity and nightmare monuments in Lisbon made me think about the importance of public participation in the decision-making, rather like Anne's arguments in favor of seeing monuments as platforms for an ongoing debate. Ongoing debate. Should there be legal frameworks to always ensure there is some kind of democratic say over the placing, amending, and removal of monuments? Or does this bring other dangers? What if what if in some cases a majority then wishes to keep a nationalistic rhetoric in place? I think that was a question for.
I think it's could be answered by anyone.
Yeah, it could be answered by any. So who of the speakers would like to address this question? Beatriz.
Thank you. I won't speak very much because I'm already taking many time speaking, but I wanted to say that we have to recognize that there is not a similar position of power. So you have the majority of the people that lives in a country that has one position, and you have the minority of grassroots movements. They are pushing and they are trying for a narrative to get installed and to be in the public agenda and political agenda. So this process that we are taking here in Portugal, it was a very participative process, but I think that is a result of a struggle that has a lot of years happening here in Portugal. So we were able to do this process we used the instrument of participatory budget of the municipality of Lisbon, and we won the process. We won the possibility of building this monument. But I think that there's on the base of our achievement, there is the grassroots movement. They're working to put the anti-racism and all these demands of more representation, of having visibility. They're putting these demands on the public space. So this transformation that is happening, that the majority are beginning to recognize the demands. The demands are very old demands for equality and for justice. That it's happening in the public space. So I think that we cannot think that it is similar from these minorities. They are invisible in the public space, and the monuments, they are already placed in the public space. So this is an ongoing process, and this is a dispute between two narratives, and we are occupying some space, but this process is always going. So I think this is achievement of the grassroots movements and the demands of the activists. They are putting on for so long these demands in the public space. So I think I agree with Nancy. We should pay special attention for the things that the grassroots movements are doing and the way they are conducting the discussion.
Thank you, Beatriz. And we have a question from Paul Mullen from Northern Ireland. I see he says, one of the challenges is to how to bring out these ignored narratives without antagonizing the right or the other in a binary debate. My question is how we can create agonistic debates, which we can learn from, rather than antagonistic debates that push people further apart. Being from Northern Ireland, we have been looking to how we can create a greater sense of narrative hospitality for other traditions or viewpoints. I think that's a question that's, or an issue that has come up several times this evening. I'm not sure if maybe one of the other speakers wants to comment on, or give suggestions or ideas about indeed how to foster an agonistic debate.
No.
May I? Okay, that is an important question, as we are living now in Portugal, a moment where the extreme right, the far right, is using anti-racism to create this idea of symmetry. Like if there was a mirror between the extreme movements of the anti-racists and their movement that is now gaining some visibility in Portugal. So I think it's tricky, and we should be very watchful on how the extreme right may be using this idea of anti-racism as rioters, as people that destruct our history, erase our past, as a narrative that can be accepted more overall, because we have a nationalist common sense, and we should be aware of that. When you see the Padrão dos Descobrimentos, that monument, it is not a monument that people see as offensive to the history of Black people, to the colonial history, to slavery. People see it as they learn in school, as an elegy to the discoveries in Portugal. That was what I learned when I was in school. So this common sense, this hegemony is really, really strong. This nationalist perspective is really, really strong. And I think to pick on Beatriz was saying, we must conduct this debate connected to the ideas of democracy, of human rights, of pluralism of opinion, because we cannot compare the extreme right that defends discrimination, defends the deportation of Black people, of Roma people in Portugal, for example, to activists that struggle for human rights, that struggle for more pluralistic views in society. So I think that debate should be talking about Padrão dos Descobrimentos, that monument that we saw that was built in 1940, the first time, and then in the 1960. First, it was in the World Portuguese exhibition, so it's a recent monument from the 20th century. I would say that no monument is too big to fall, okay? But I do agree that we must be strategic on how we address these monuments, on how we address these representations, on the power that these representations, or this idea of the material, as Anne was saying, the material, there is a fetishism over the material history. So the destruction of those monuments as the power to bring indignation for those that believe that we are erasing history. So I think the idea of counter narratives in the space of education, other monuments, in the museums, are spaces that we should use when we live in a society such as Portugal, in which the colonial nostalgia and the idea that the discoveries and the Portuguese past is something to be praised, is still hegemonic. We have to counter that using strategies as the one that Beatriz organization did in the participatory budget in Lisbon, but also throughout education, in our conferences, in our participation in the media, building new forms of democracy, of democratization of our look to the past.
Right. Thank you, Bruno. Nancy, Sofia. I would like to go to the chat box, if that's okay, because there's actually a parallel discussion happening there as well.
I think everybody can.
I'm not sure if not everyone can see it. Let's assume that.
Should we say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Can you summarize it if you want?
Oh well, we're talking about monuments all the time, and a lot of people are sharing. Like, well, there's a lot of input people can have on monuments, actually, which I think is really important that people are stating that, at least for the Netherlands, that is, I think, for some of, but I think we're talking about a broader issue here, also about buildings and what they convey, or what is in the built environment. Like in the Netherlands, we literally have statues or monuments built in a building, for instance, which makes it, but also the tons of street names. I think there's hundreds of cities, well, I might be exaggerating, but that are called J.P. Koen, who is a villain in the eyes of most people, most post-colonial communities. So, and that's very hard to push, to get out of the listing. So because people oppose that very strongly. So I think there's also, several issues to look at. And the chat we were at was about cultural citizenship and what that entails. And so we were going back and forth on that.
Yeah, so the lesson learned from this is if you're in a Zoom discussion, also have an eye on the chat, because there is a lot of interesting stuff happening there as well.
Yeah, or put the chat out.
Yeah, or that, yes.
Sorry, Remco, yeah.
No, yeah, you can go.
I've been sort of trying to pick out the questions and also reading through the comments, of course. And Tamara van Kessel added another one, which I think could be interesting for Rebecca. And so Nancy raises the question of which words we use. Monuments often go with text. How does this relate to the power of image? Is a revised text enough to change the meaning and power or vibration to pick up Anne's reference to vibrant matter of an image?
It's a great question. I think it's interesting that monuments, I think the text, if I'm correct, I think the text that Tamara is referring to is a revised text that would accompany a monument instead perhaps of its removal or destruction. But actually, I think what's one of the most interesting things about monuments is that they already come with texts themselves. Epitaphs are like a huge part of how monuments contextualize themselves within the public space. And often it's the most kind of, especially in the case of Edward Colston, whose memorial plaque with the epitaph on I showed earlier, it's the most kind of violent representation or rewriting of history, and it occurs in those words. I am not, personally, I am not 100% sure about how much having a revised text next to a monument would disrupt the idea that this monument is a celebration. So for example, I guess if the monument to Edward Colston was still standing and next to it was a small bit of explanatory text, visually there's like the celebration of his figure is still there, and it requires you being able to read that text or making an effort to go up to that text, unless it was projected onto something, which I highly doubt it would be. So I think there are lots of complexities with this idea of recontextualizing monuments. Does that really answer that question? Just kind of...
I think so, yeah. And because indeed, I think what Tamara was, yeah, how does this relate to the power of image? Indeed, because the statue would still remain there, and it's so much bigger than any plaque could be. Well, I mean, I guess you could create a enormous plaque next to the monument, or a separate monument. I think you also mentioned that example. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Beatriz had her hand up. I'll mute.
Beatriz wanted to respond, yes.
Yes, I just want to say a thing. Colonialism, it was a history of violence. It was a violence against Black people, Asian people, against all the people of the occupied countries. So we are in a place in history where we are always confront with this violence. So we can't accept no longer. We can't accept that this history of violence stays without being criticized. So I don't think that we can talk about the violence, the genocide, all the things that happened during colonization with a simple plaque saying that people made these things, because we have this hegemonic narrative, this idea of supremacy that is put in place, that keeps Black people, Asian, and all the other minorities has second citizenship people that don't have the same rights, people that they had a lot of obstacles in everyday life, in housing, in jobs, in many things. So to end this history of violence, we must confront all these ideas of similarity that we have, all these ideas of supremacy that we have, and all these people that are in public space that has this huge power. They're part of a selection of a history that is put in public space, that wants to tell a slice of wants to tell the history of the winning of colonization from the perspective of the white people that explore, that get very rich with colonization. So we must keep this in mind when we are discussing public figures and public space and the monuments that we have in public spaces, and the street names and all the things that are in public spaces. They're part of a narrative that wants to keep an hierarchy of people. Some people are more important than the others. They are keeping this golden era nostalgia, the colonial nostalgia. So we must think about this, and we must oppose to that.
Yeah, thank you. Very beautifully said, Beatriz. So I see now, Sofia, we're 15 minutes late. It's now 9:15, which maybe is a good time to stop, at least give people that have and want to leave the opportunity to do so. If there is people that are really keen to ask one last question to one of the speakers, they can stay behind if they want and post a question in the chat. But is that okay for you? To start wrapping up, Sofia?
Yeah, of course. I think also Beatriz's last contribution was also a very nice way, I think, to finish. And
that's very true, actually.
So unless there's a very how do you say
urgent, urgent thing to address,
then I would suggest indeed, because we are running a little bit over time.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I breathe out of a sigh out of relief because I thought it was a very interesting session. I want to thank all 5 of our speakers, which is an incredible number of speakers to have in such a session. But thank you all. Thank you, Anne, Rebecca, Bruno, Beatriz, and Nancy for your contributions. Yeah. I'm happy we recorded this. I will be listening back. Yeah. And I hope that we can share this indeed on the ICOMOS website anytime soon, and we will inform you on that.
Yes. Thank you so much for everyone for participating, and especially for the speakers for these incredible contributions and sharing these very important thoughts.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.